a Georgetown law professor, and I write about this thing called sovereign debt, which is sort of unfortunately obscurely named because it really is the carbon of carbon life form when it comes to international finance. It's at the core of financial markets, it's at the core of government functions, and it is, and has been for a while, in some amount of trouble. So I am thrilled that you are here, and I am sad that everybody who's not here is missing out. We are very lucky to have with us today a very diverse set of perspectives, both in with respect to the kind of the interdisciplinary nature of this field, as well as bridging between theory and practice. But before I go there, also bridging between theory and practice, if you would like to get CLE, continuing legal education credit, for this panel, you must find one of the ASIL volunteers by the door. They have a white ribbon on their badge. Check in with them. Unless you find that person on your way in and on your way out, again, white ribbon on their badge, credit will not be awarded for continuing legal education, which would be a shame because this will be very educational. So we are at a very fraught point in the very long history of public debt and sovereign debt in particular, where we started out with more than half of all low-income countries in debt distress, and that number is growing. We were stressed before the pandemic. We are way more stressed right now. Perhaps more importantly, for purposes of this conversation, we are in somewhat of an institutional awkward place where the institutions that had developed for managing sovereign debt problems repeatedly have proven themselves to be inadequate to 21st century challenges. And we can only expect the gap to grow in as much as the pandemic we saw, the climate shocks that we continue to see are not one-off events. We can expect to see more vulnerable countries affected by a series of shocks. And so it behooves us to reconsider the institutional architecture in this space and start looking for solutions. On the bright side, I couldn't have wished for a better group of people to brainstorm about these solutions. To my immediate left, Professor James Tuogati, who not only leads up the Afronomics blog, but was also a platform, but of course is well known to this group for his seminal Grotius lecture a couple of years ago, but really for his seminal contribution to theorizing and applying public international law to the kinds of problems we are talking about. When I was still a law student, he was already famous, so I am truly, seriously, and he's not that old. So I couldn't be more grateful for his willingness to start this conversation. After James, my dear friend Yan Liu, who is Deputy General Counsel at the International Monetary Fund, has written extensively in this area, has thought in great depth about all aspects of this problem, again, for a very long time, notwithstanding her obvious youth. And then rounding out our youthful panel in person is Professor Michael Weibel from the University of Vienna, who has published lots and lots of books and articles in this space, particularly on dispute resolution, adjudication, and institutional design on his own and in collaboration with many folks in this space. And finally, really rounding out the panel is Professor Avinash Persaud, who is joining us at, I believe, some very ungodly hour from, you're an Indian right now, right? Yes.
I am indeed, Carol.
Okay, so he's staying up for our sake, and but of course he has held many positions in the government of Barbados, and in particular those focusing. He's done a tremendous amount of work on financial reform and on climate finance and climate resilience. And he has very much been leading the discussion on Prime Minister Myanmar Motley's Bridgetown initiative, and really he will close out this conversation, well, our opening remarks, with a broader view on where we put public debt relative to the broader challenges of climate and climate finance. So with that, I'm handing it over to James. We'll try to save some questions for some time for discussion. So please start thinking about your questions. And again, call your friends, standing room only crowd. This is where all the answers are going to be. Professor Gatti.
Well, thanks, Anna, for that kind introduction. Everything that I know about sovereign debt, I have learned from her, including on the recent ongoing financial crisis. She has a great piece in the Yale Journal of Regulation I was reading this morning. But anyway, since I see Professor Biora Okafor in the crowd, he tells me to get to the point. Since he's going to fall asleep since he's hearing my voice, my point is this fraught moment is a forever moment. The problem we are facing that Professor Anna Gelpan described is a systemic, structural, endemic, and not an episodic problem. So Professor Gelpan asked me to answer the question, what does this have to do with international law? And I shudder to say this since I'm seated next to Yan Liu, who is at the IMF, but the governance of, and I did intern at the IMF, so some time ago, governance of the global financial system on which the sovereign debt system sits is a colonial legacy established after the Second World War, when most of the debt vulnerable countries were not at the table. The agreement establishing the International Monetary Fund, the Articles of Agreement, is a treaty. Now, this treaty provides that the way in which the IMF makes decision is on a system of weighted voting. It's not one country, one vote, like the UN General Assembly, which means that of the 55 African countries that are members of the fund, they have a total of 6.01% of the voting rights. Kenya, where I grew up, has 0.14% of the voting rights. The US has over 17% of the voting share at the IMF, which means because decisions at the IMF are made by 85 majority voting power, to change the quota system, the US has an absolute veto on any changes on which this colonial system, on which the global financial system sits. Basically, it has a veto on changing that system. This year is supposed to be the year when the quota reform is going to be discussed. Sort of, this was kicked down the road a couple of years ago to this year. And because of the changes in the global economy with especially the rise of China and the BRICS, this is a really important moment, but it's unlikely to happen again this year because the US has an absolute veto on changing the system on which the entire global financial system sits. The one element of this, the role of the IMF, is all sort of closely connected with the Paris Club, which is not, it's an informal organization, but a really powerful one. in which the bulk of the special drawing rights of the IMF are held by sort of these Western countries in addition to the United States. And their approval is absolutely necessary before any renegotiation of sovereign debt can commence at the Paris Club. So you're talking about the IMF sitting on the one side here, and then we have the Paris Club on the other, and this is not to talk about the private creditors, a whole other ballgame. But I wanted also to mention that another tool the IMF uses, besides its surveillance in exercise of its surveillance authority, is this debt sustainability analysis that it conducts to assess whether a country suffers from a temporary liquidity problem. And these analyses are heavily weighted in favor of continued borrowing. And at the Afronomics Law, the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network, we have a paper written by sort of one of our researchers on the debt sustainability analysis. They sort of bracket out questions of human rights or other types of considerations. And it really means that then governments have a very high imperative to pay and to prioritize debt repayments because this is sort of the first item in every budget of a heavily indebted country, the claims to creditors, prioritized over things like education, prioritized over things like food and other basic necessities. And so developing countries are not saying these things for the first time. From the moment that they got a voice in the United Nations General Assembly, in the Group of 77, in UNCTAD and in other places, they've always regarded both the IMF and the Paris Club as being inequitable, insensitive to their needs, and in fact have long proposed major reforms outside of the global financial system controlled by the IMF as an alternative to what's going on today. So that's really my first major point. The second point, and I think I have 4 points in case Professor...
You're about halfway through.
Yeah, I'm about halfway through. I have 3 points. So from this perspective, the IMF and the Paris Club and the private creditors really want minimalist reforms to the global financial system, just enough to contain the pressure for more radical reform where of course, they reap massive profits from this system. So all the new frameworks we've had, the common framework, the new debt roundtable intended to bring China in, among others, are merely minimalist reforms kicking the can down the road. They are based on the assumption that IMF is here to stay, the current international financial system is here to stay, and the menu of options of these minimalist reforms, I don't even want to call them the reforms, these minimalist efforts are simply Band-Aid on a major problem. I'd just like to note that there have been other efforts. The IMF itself and one of the former chief economists had led this effort, the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. But I also want to mention that this year is the 70th anniversary of the London Debt Agreement of 1953, which forgave a huge amount of German debt. Why isn't what's good for Germany good for the highly vulnerable countries? If you read the UN report written by Joseph Stiglitz-led committee, and Avinash was part of that commission after the 2008 financial crisis, and you read the reports coming out of the IMF today, they're talking about the same things. Climate change, all these sort of crises sort of converging at this moment. This year is also another important anniversary, which is an anniversary of a UN Security Council resolution forgiving Iraqi debt in 2003, and an executive order of the President of the United States immunizing other Iraqi assets the very day of the UN Security Council resolution, and also immunizing the assets of Iraq from execution for sort of satisfying creditor claims. So if that's good for Iraq, why isn't that good for the rest of the world? When the developed world wants to have the political will to address this debt problem, they have done so, as I have said in those two examples. So the very last thing I want to say before I shut up, I have 1 minute. Another reality, of course, is the fact that with new players in the globe, in the debt market, like the Chinese Development Bank and others, now you have public-private entities that are making it really difficult for developing countries like Zambia at the moment, Sri Lanka and others, in the context of a major geopolitical fight between the US and China. So in 1 week, we had sort of Chinese officials rushing through Zambia, and in the following week, the US Treasury Secretary and the IMF Managing Director, sort of indicating the extent to which these geopolitical fights are really key to understanding what's not going on with helping these countries to overcome this crisis. So I'll shut up for this first round.
Well, hopefully you will continue in the exchange we will have throughout. So thank you so much for starting us off. And Yan, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Do I need to press any button?
The middle.
Oh. Right? Okay. Thank you, Anna. And it's really a great pleasure to be a part of this distinguished panel. And James, thank you so much for already laying out the history of the IMF and touch upon some of the issues that we face. I fully agree with you. Countries are really facing increasing, debt distress, and we need to look at the international architecture to find ways to, support better and faster and more efficient restructuring process. But I thought I would take a step back to talk a little bit about why IMF cares about sovereign debt restructuring, what role we can play and how we play that role, and also highlight a couple of challenges that we're facing today. Well, the IMF approach to sovereign debt restructuring is best understood in the context of our lending mandate. That is to provide financing to help countries address their balance of payment problems and to return to a medium-term external viability under we call adequate safeguards, which really means the country will be in a position to repay the IMF. So we're typically called upon to address debt issues when we lend to a country that has already run into debt problems or has lost market access. In most cases, really a combination of policy adjustments and IMF lending is enough because it catalyzes external financing so that the country can continue servicing its debt and preserve market access. But when the debt is assessed to be unsustainable, I think James already mentioned our debt sustainability assessment instrument. So we use that instrument to make such determination. So when the debt is unsustainable, under our articles and policies, we're precluded from lending unless the country is taking steps to restore debt sustainability, including through a debt operation. But I want to stress that this type of cases are the exception rather than the norm. But when the time really comes, we do have interest in ensuring the restructuring takes place timely and orderly and achieves sufficiently high creditor participation. I think we all recognize this is easily said than done. For instance, authorities are often reluctant to restructure their debt because they're concerned about their economic, financial, and political risks they have to take. They're also afraid they're going to scare off future lenders. The problem is that the longer they wait, the worse the situation will get. I think on the creditor side, we have the same problem, or at least a similar problem. The creditors have very different strategies and objectives, and some of them may refuse to restructure. So lack of creditor coordination can create delays and then push the country in a default. that is really detrimental to all parties involved and to the system as a whole. So what is the role of the IMF? So let me tell you what we cannot do first. We're not advisors to country, so we're not involved in a country's decision on whether and how to structure its debt. We're also not involved in negotiation with creditors. That is the job of the authorities and their advisors. What we do is to bring parties together and help them address some of these challenges through a set of policies. These policies were developed, really back in 1970s, 80s, but they have been adapted to the new developments really over the time. So I cannot go through all the policies, but I just want to give you a sense of how our policy really applies. Debt and stability, James already mentioned. This is really a key requirement for all our lending. This is because we want to make sure that our lending will not compound a country's debt problems by adding more non-restructurable debt. Our debt cannot be restructured under our articles. And also we want to make sure the country really implement reform measures to address the underlying BOP problems so that they can regain market access. So our debt and stability determination plays an important role in our own lending decision, but also it has an important bearing on the timing of a restructuring. I want to mention also another point, which is so important for us, is that we definitely defines the financing gap, for a program, but we don't prescribe or we don't get involved in burden sharing across creditors, meaning like official creditor, you should have 50% haircut, private creditor, you should have 20. Again, that's the job of the authorities. But we do recognize inequitable burden sharing, is problematic because it's going to lead to low participation by creditors in restructuring. That's going to really pose problems to the restructuring itself. So we have developed over the years different approaches to pre-default, post-default cases, also depending on the nature of the creditors. For instance, James mentioned official bilateral creditors like China, US, France. So in pre-default context, we don't require these creditors to restructure their debt in order for us to lend, meaning we don't require actual debt treatment. We do require them to provide so-called specific and credible assurances that they will restructure their debt in line with the parameters of an IMF program. And then we're also flexible with modality of the assurances. It can be Paris Club agreed minutes or common framework creditor statement or written assurances from individual creditor. When a country is in default, we have a different set of policy we call arrears policy. Basically, that policy will kick in. And that policy defines the conditions under which we can lend, despite the arrears incurred by the debtor. And there, for instance, in some cases, the country can just consent. So I only have 1 minute left, so let me just mention the one big challenge we have right now is the assurances I just mentioned. Despite all the flexibility we have built into our policy, we recognize that, given the diverse creditor base, this flexibility does not work very well because it was associated with the Paris Club context. I think common framework, James also mentioned, the progress was very slow. And even you look outside the common framework, the restructuring process is also very slow. Look at Sri Lanka. We reached staff-level agreement with the authorities on the IMF program last September. It took 6 months for creditors to give us our required assurances. So I know there are a lot of proposals that have been put forward to address these issues. On the fund side, we are looking at our policies and processes to see how we can strike a better balance between flexibility and safeguards for our own lending, and to really find a way to incentivize creditor engagement, and also that would really help us to provide timely financing to the countries in crisis. So let me stop here.
Thanks very much, Yen. Mikael?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to Anna and my fellow panelists. The question I would like to address is whether domestic statutes can help ensure private sector participation in sovereign debt restructurings. In 2010, the United Kingdom was the first country in modern times to introduce a statute whose aim was to ensure that private creditors participate on comparable terms to official creditors in providing debt relief to low-income countries. And the result was the Developing Countries Debt Relief Act of 2010, on which I worked at the time. In my view, such statutes can usefully complement and enhance the international community's collective action policy. As we've already heard from my fellow panelists, the international debt architecture confronts major challenges. Debt restructurings have become messier still in recent years. And here, domestic statutes can help. There is growing disillusionment shared by many, as Brad Setzer describes in a recent paper, with the common framework. It fails to deliver much-needed debt relief on a timely basis. Only 4 countries have applied and none has received debt relief so far. So the common framework is not working, or at least it's not working fast enough. And domestic statutes can help with these challenges and fill gaps in our current architecture because they can incentivize private sector participation and can help accelerate the development of judicial doctrines that require all creditors to provide comparable treatment. What are some of the key features of the 2010 Act in the United Kingdom, the first and most detailed legislation to date? This Act limits the amount that creditors can recover through lawsuits before UK courts to the level dictated by the HIPIC initiative. That is, creditors, private creditors, cannot recover more than if they had participated in HIPIC. This debt is not cancelled, but rendered unenforceable. And this applies irrespective of the law that applies to the debt. The law applies to any judgment by a court, foreign judgments enforceable in the UK, as well as arbitral awards, except for ICSID awards. And to some extent, the UK Act has inspired copycat legislation in other countries, including in Belgium and France. Belgium has a much broader act that applies to all countries and limits the enforceability of debt claims to what the purchaser paid when it acquired the claim. It relies on a criterion of illegitimate profit, but that has been criticized by some as being vague. The French law of 2016 amended the Code des procédures civiles d'exécution and also seeks to curtail speculation by creditors. And in a number of scenarios, it provides that creditors cannot enforce against sovereign debtors. There are some other important differences between these acts, and then there are 2 pending legislative proposals in the state of New York, which is, of course, a very important venue for sovereign debt litigation. And these go in some respects further, and particularly the second pending bill would amend New York state banking law, and on that basis allow a debtor state to file a petition which would then lead to an audit of whether the country's debt is unsustainable. So I think there is mileage in domestic statutes to ensure creditor participation, and policymakers are coming around to this view too, including David Malpass and Christina Georgieva, as well as their institutions. The World Bank, in an important report last year, encouraged the development of domestic statutory approaches. 13 years after the UK, the coalition agreement of the current German government calls for the introduction of a statute in Germany too. And earlier this month, the Development Committee of the House of Commons in the UK urged, and I quote, an interventionist legislative approach to incentivize and compel all creditors, including the private sector, to participate in debt relief. It strongly encouraged the UK government to go beyond the 2010 Act and to enlarge that to all countries, certainly all countries eligible for the common framework, or to even go further still and adopt a holistic approach, that is, to make all debt restructuring agreements binding for all creditors if a supermajority of 2/3 approves. The committee also encouraged UK lawmakers to engage with New York lawmakers to explore potential cooperation on legislative approaches. And in my view, such action is indeed urgent, as the reliance on collective action clauses plus aggregation alone and other voluntary initiatives is simply not enough to prevent the next major debt crisis. And domestic statutes can play a very useful role to close this gap to ensure comparability of treatment for all creditors. Thank you.
That was brilliantly on time. Thank you. And brilliant in every other way. But wow. Professor Persaud, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So, come to you from the perspective of a borrower, a powerless, vulnerable country, a borrower from the IMF, as well as from the World Bank, a negotiator of a debt restructuring, and a negotiator with the private sector on producing natural disaster clauses. I think the first thing I'd say is, Jane kicked us off with really putting the cat amongst the pigeons in talking about that political problem the fund has. And, it needs to be addressed at some point, because unless we do, it does shape the inadequacies of the fund. What I would say, though, is that forming it is not simple. There isn't a simple alternative approach. Take the Green Climate Fund. We tried very hard as developing countries to create a governance structure that gave us greater voice, and it succeeded. And the result, because power is always resentful at being taken away, Climate Fund has become the slowest development institution in the world. They find all kinds of ways of addressing power being taken away. It's what we evolved to a position where I think the way that the powerless can benefit from the international system is the more mechanistic we can make it, the more triggers and mechanisms and rules that works best. Three things we should be doing with the debt world. Firstly, we just saw how the Federal Reserve responds to a local banking crisis. We've seen it before. All G7 central banks know do. You provide market-wide, unlimited, unconditional liquidity to all. You make sure there's no stigma in coming to you. How do we do international financial debt crises? Case by case, conditional, expensive. We need a market-wide approach to international debt problems. And the reason why we don't is politics. Case by case maximizes power. We need to change that. The second thing is that, one of the challenges we have in the world is not reluctant creditors. It's reluctant borrowers. Borrowers don't restructure enough. Borrowers don't default enough. And borrowers to default need the International Monetary Fund. Now, they can help borrowers default. The problem is they're reluctant to go to the fund. They're afraid of the ad hoc political nature of the fund, rightly or wrongly. We may argue that's the wrong thing, but they fear it. And that fear is very real indeed. So the fund needs to deal with the fear of fund. And that fear of fund relates to ad hoc approach. Maybe they have a very clear, transparent, and rule-based approach to how the fund will deal with restructurings of programs. Borrowers are afraid you're going to slash our pensions, slash our wages, and very few countries get re-elected after going to a fund. The final thing is we need to reorganize, we need to get debt off the balance sheets of developing countries. Loss and damage from climate should not be on the balance sheet of developing countries. We need a fund that funds climate loss and damage. There's much discussion around that. Mitigation for climate, that should not be on the balance sheet of developing countries. Today it is. 86% of all climate mitigation is on the balance sheet of developing countries. We need a new entity that invests in climate mitigation, the green transition, sustainable agriculture off the balance sheet of developing countries. And the final thing is when you're in a restructuring, the debt sustainability analysis, it's the crudest piece of arithmetic you've ever come across. You add up all the debt and you divide by GDP. So we need something that's much more sensible. We need a weighted system which looks at debt that is there for investing in the future and reducing costs and creating savings. That shouldn't count the same as debt for consumption. Thank you.
Wow, okay, so you were actually under time, my dear friend. So you get an extra, you get the closing, the last word. So here's how I would like to shape the rest of this. First, I want to kind of try a narrative thread and see what we get, particularly if not everybody in this room has been in sort of the innards of collective action clauses and adequate assurance policies and all of that, right? So James started out, very importantly, by framing the structural problem, sort of our baseline. This is where we are, and this is where we come from. We have institutions with the, 20th century, mid-20th century governance mechanisms. We have stakeholders that weren't around and are not invested in those governance mechanisms and arguably do not see a whole lot of benefit from those. But this is, as Avinash said, this is sort of where we are. And so in some ways, part of our job is to try to figure out how to get from here to there, not from a fictional time zero to there. And so in that architecture, the IMF is at the center. This is really a 1980s sort of development, arguably, where it defines the combination of economic reforms and financing that should restore balance of payments. Now, note, it is not, balance of payment is not what everybody sort of sees as their goal in life, right? It could be human flourishing, it could be breakfast, right? So the fact that this is how the institution is designed, that is at the center of all this, Yen didn't make it up, it's in the charter, right? So this is what we're working with. Now, having defined that envelope, then the debtor, mind you, the stakeholder that is arguably at its weakest at that moment, right? This is the debtor in crisis. They have the most limited resources. They have the most limited bandwidth. And it is on them to then go out and get restructuring done, get new money, get comparable treatment, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what might make this a bit easier or more challenging? There are institutions that coordinate different groups of creditors, including, as James mentioned, the Paris Club. The Common Framework is a 2020 sort of aspirational would-be successor to the Paris Club. I'm not asking anybody to endorse this, but it's a broader group of official bilateral creditors, government to government. Right? Traditionally, the Paris Club, but also the Common Framework require the term you've heard, comparable treatment. Again, it's on the debtor to go and seek comparable treatment from other creditors. Why intercreditor equity underpins a more durable restructuring? I think that's the idea. How you interpret equity and how do you interpret durable are both fascinating questions. There are also incentives within these fora for actors to cooperate or not, and collective action clauses are a one element of that, right? It's a contractual incentive. But really, let's pull back now, right, and say, well, contracts exist in a legal framework, and certainly, what Michal introduced us to is that just because there is a public international framework doesn't mean that domestic laws go away, and private financial markets operate within national legal regimes as well as a framework of international coordination. And this is where domestic legislation can play an important role. And as James pointed out, public international mechanisms, UN Security Council, can help nudge, shape domestic measures. But then in the end, what we really need is the term that Avinash pointed to, which is a balance sheet clearing. There is a debt on the books of these countries that they cannot and perhaps should not be carrying. And again, the question is, what do all of these institutions that we've all touched on kind of have to do with it? How can they help us get from here to there? So with that, here's what I would like to do. I would like to give my colleagues an opportunity to intervene, comment on anything they wish. In the meantime, if anybody in the room has questions, I believe the microphones in the middle of the room are there for people to stand behind them and talk into them. And it would be great if you have a question, if you could just come up to the microphone while we're commentating. So, Professor Gatti, thoughts?
It's James, my colonial name.
Okay.
I just have two very quick things to say, and these are very provocative. I think, I've been dying to say this, Avinash. We need more Barbados. We need more Mia Motley's being heads of government in indebted countries.
Tell her.
It's not, Avinash, it's not just that they are afraid. If you look at African countries, almost maybe except Ghana, where one of her students is one of the deputy directors of the Ghanaian Central Bank. Sorry.
I'm joking.
And who've really been pushing back another of those sort of institutions that are the sort of discipline makers, like the credit rating agencies, that threaten to downgrade the the credit of any country that dares to even think of participating in any of these frameworks, the common framework, another one, the debt suspension initiative that was suspended after COVID. It's just, I'm sorry to say this, but they're sort of neoliberals. They're sort of people from the University of Chicago who actually believe in the system. And overwhelmingly endorse the system. So that is why we don't have much of sort of collective action among the indebted countries. And I think that's a major problem. To overcome this, I think, Avinash, it's not only sort of the mechanisms, it's sort of the agency from developing countries. And the fact that the West can rely on these sort of people who have drunk the Kool-Aid, as I tell my students, it's just going to keep kicking the can down the road.
And actually, if we could address this borrower reluctance problem, which I think is just absolutely critical. Is it like false consciousness? Is it, what is it? Is it real? Is it a real impediment? Is there just, do people don't know? Is it time inconsistency? So anyway, sorry, I promised to shut up and I didn't. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel I'm really sitting in a hot chair. Anyway, Anna, you really laid out the problems and the challenges and also constraints very well. As you said, we are governed by our charter. We can only provide financing to help countries address BOP problems. I think that is the fundamental, right, element of our lending. But I don't want just sort of look at the challenges and the problems we're facing. I think it's a beautiful weather out there. We should be a little bit more optimistic, think about the ways how to really address. I think I mentioned very briefly, there are few proposals that have been put forward. For instance, common framework, we all know they have a lot of challenges, but it is a breakthrough in the sense that there is a forum to bring in Paris Club and non-Paris Club creditors. I know they have a lot of issues and we have to deal with that on a daily basis, but I think there are proposals from G20 and also from, really international community, right, to help improve that process, including to extend the coverage of common framework to cover other countries, not just the 74, right, the DSSI countries. And, if they can really get their acts together with the push from the IMF, from everybody else, if they can really speed up their process and simplify the procedures, I think it is a promising forum, for official creditors to coordinate and make a decision. It may take time, but I'm just saying under the current circumstances. I think you mentioned collective actions. There are other contractual tools. For example, the most favored creditor, provisions, right? There's a lot of interest in that provisions. They have been used in Ukraine and also in Argentina, but we can maybe have a steroid version of it to bind in creditors across classes and also across the aisle, meaning private and official creditors together. But I think Michael also mentioned statutory approach. I think I have to speak for myself. We're not against it. It can be a very good complement, right, to help address collective action problems. The only issue is that we just have to design it in the right way, not to create moral hazard, and see how that really work together, with other initiatives. So I think there are some tools out there. Last but not least, I think IMF, we have to look at our own policies. We have to figure out, whether our policy framework or the processes that have worked historically very well may not work well anymore because of the changes. We really have to think hard and look hard at how we do things and come up with ways to, strike a balance. I won't say we're going to revolutionize the institution next day. We can't do that. It is an institution built on consensus. I think James mentioned, U.S. does have a veto power, right? So we have to recognize the political reality, but try to find ways to really improve the architecture. Thank you.
Thanks. Yep. So Anna mentioned that debtor governments in crisis have very limited bandwidth, and they find themselves in a position of weakness. And while I recognize that it's important that perhaps debtor governments are bolder and that they don't fear restructurings if they are needed, I think more of the onus should be on those who don't find themselves in that unfortunate position. That is, all governments should be bolder, particularly governments that find themselves in a position of strength. James mentioned the anniversary of the London Debt Agreement for the Federal Republic of Germany in 1953. I think more governments in this space should be acting behind a veil of ignorance. They can't be sure whether in 30 or 50 years they themselves will need to restructure their debt. So I think we should expect more of governments like the UK or Germany and others. And I think we are seeing some movement in the right direction there.
Thank you very much. Avinash, and then Ye, we have a question after you.
Yeah. So 3 quick points. I mean, you and Jan brought up the important point of the balance of payments role in the charter. And, we've witnessed the IMF go through some acrobatics on occasions to basically try and be consistent with that charter. It's probably time we evolve that charter. And we were talking about the IBRD having a evolved remit to include a focus on global public goods, for instance. It may be a time to reform. What's the point of spending all the time going through acrobatics when the nature of the fund and what it does and the critical role it plays has changed? We no longer have a system, fixed and pegged exchange rates that they're trying to manage. A totally different system, and the charter should reflect that. One of the reasons why debtors are not more bold is because these institutions, they're vengeful. When we hosted a peace conference with the Venezuelan parties, including the government of Venezuela and the opposition, we were denied a loan. from one of these IFIs. These, and if you say publicly things they don't like, they're vengeful institutions. It's the nature of power. We need some kind of agent that protects those debtors and those powerless in their negotiations with the IFIs. And one way, and that's why I love these mechanistic approaches, and one that we, as you know, we've been championing is a much more refined SSI, natural disaster clauses in all financial institutions. It would have released $1 trillion of liquidity during COVID if everyone had them. $1 trillion. No MDB or IFI offers anybody anything close. It would have given us 17% of GDP of liquidity. And it's automaticity, and you don't need to apply to anyone. You don't need to go get approval from any board. There's some very clear triggers when it gets triggered.
Thank you very much. One question for a lot of these devices is, to the extent the debtor has discretion to trigger, will they? And I appreciate the banking parallel earlier, right? This is very much what we're talking about with banking, right? You have buffers. Are you going to use them? And what does the signal convey? But we have a question. Please identify yourself and ask away. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kanle Zhang. I teach at Peking University in Beijing, China. Used to be a student of Anna's, and I really enjoyed this panel because of putting names on, for example, Professor Gatti, so many names on papers that I cite in my own work anyway. So perhaps two questions. The first one more, a quick question to Professor Weibel. Does the statutory approach raise any sort of issues domestically in terms of the sort of interaction between the legislation and the central bank or Ministry of Finance? Because I've understood as sovereign debt being managed internationally by the central banks, by the Ministry of Finance, versus a statutory approach perhaps is done from a different democratic institute. So is there any dynamic there? A second or broader question, so after the first round of presentation, and when Professor Prasad ended with the comments on, for example, the borrowers do not default enough and all these comments, which were brilliant. These, for me, ties really well with what Professor Galper was saying at the beginning, that sovereign debt is really at the core of international finance. It's at the core of, well, also related to international law and that. So for me, it seems there are two approaches to the sovereign debt issue. One approach approaches as what people have been doing. One approach being making use of the existing frameworks, legal instruments. So that's IMF, that's Paris Club, that's all the contractual instruments we have. The other one, what people have been doing is to think about, for example, of inequality between monetary sovereignty, to think about the sort of inequalities built into the infrastructure of international finance. So, for example, dollar dominance, for example, credit rating agencies, which are originated in the United States and playing a major role, for example, in the debt relief in 2020. So, in terms of the private creditors and the unwillingness of the debtors to actually renegotiate or to get any kind of relief because they were afraid of the rating agencies and so on. So what I'm trying to say is that there seem to be these two approaches. So one is to make use of the legal instruments. The other one is to reflect on the power imbalance built into the infrastructure of international law or international finance. Yet I do not really see sort of a communication or interaction between those two approaches. And also I'm frustrated myself with the first approach being let's do more. There are new things like statutory approaches domestically. But then the second approach with this sort of theoretical critical reflections seems to do not lead anywhere except from unraveling the power imbalance built into the system. So any thoughts on what we could do with the sort of dying situation of the sovereign debt issue? Thanks.
So can we take the building blocks and rebuild a more equitable system, or do we just, was that sort of continuing from that? Okay. I mean, basically, can you take the building blocks and have them add up to something that addresses inequality, right, and power dynamics? Or is sort of power dynamics we're yelling on the outside and the building blocks are, churning on the inside? Maybe, Michael, if you could start us and then we can...
Well, I maybe...
Michael, Avinash...
Maybe I'll start with the narrow question,
Yeah.
the hard question to my fellow panelists. Maybe using the example of the UK, which is the example I know best. So when the 2010 Act was developed, multiple departments were involved. HM Treasury was in the lead. There was some concern what this act might mean for the UK as a financial center. To my knowledge, the Bank of England was not significantly involved in the development of this legislation. Because of this concern, what this might mean for the UK as a financial center, but also for party political reasons, the Act initially had a sunset clause of 1 year. There was a review by the new Conservative Liberal government before the expiry of that 1 year period, where they looked closely at the pros and cons and concluded there were very few cons and significant advantages of the Act, and the Act was made permanent.
Microphone.
Hi. I've lost sound from you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. So Avinash, then Yen, then James, and then maybe Avinash. Because you have time saved up.
Well, I only if you insist. So I think listening to the question from the audience made me realize that a lot of the political and power issues we talked about are quite intertwined and compounded. It made me think about your excellent paper, Anna, which has caused me a lot of thinking about safe assets and how fundamentally the asymmetry of our system relates to the asymmetry of safe assets. We have a small number of countries that produce safe assets, and the rest of us import safe assets. And that's one of the reasons why South Africa and Poland, they have similar economic fundamentals, but their cost of capital, their ratings are all very, very different. And what's the solution to that? Interestingly, the IFIs, in all kinds of ways that lawyers would understand better than economists, reinforce the existing safe asset arrangement in what they count as collateral and what they count as safe. And so you have an asymmetry of a system that's reinforced by the existing IFIs who do nothing to try and undermine the very narrow system of safe assets that we have. They're doing nothing of creating some innovative new safe assets and changing the asymmetry and imbalance of the safe assets we have. That would be one role of a different set of IFIs, that they're creating innovations to create a much more level arrangement where we don't have a set of countries that are exporting and countries, another set that are only always importing safe assets.
Thank you. Yen.
Yeah, this is the question about using the building blocks to improve
some
or
version
something
of it
version.
that you
Okay.
can adapt to an answer that you can give.
So, so the only thing I want to mention is that, we try to be creative back into early 2000, as Anna knows. We came up with this idea of sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. We had this beautiful blueprint, and I was involved. I think Anna was also involved in helping us think through some of these issues. We try to replicate the corporate, insolvency regime for sovereign debt purposes, including setting up a tribunal to arbitrate, the issues But still, the trigger, would depend on the IMF own assessment of debt instability. I thought that was actually, I wouldn't say really the perfect solution, but it's pretty well thought out solution. But we didn't get enough support from our membership. For some advanced economies, they don't want to give up their sovereignty. I think for EM, they're concerned about the negative impact on their rating, and they're somehow give the impression that they will do debt restructuring more often. I think for leaks, they're also concerned about their access to the market. All I'm trying to say is that a lot of these options or the proposals, I think we do need to think about them or test their feasibility and acceptability in this broad context of a political economy. It doesn't mean that we cannot change, but again, I'm going back. I think for me, it's probably you have to use the building blocks to improve rather than to change completely.
Thank you. So we're going to get kicked out of the room pretty soon. So Avinash, I'm re-expropriating your closing time. I'm sorry. But I do want to highlight that what Yen just described was the IMF within its constitutional parameters being insanely creative and getting slapped down. And, some of us might think it was too modest, but for who they are, that was going wild. So with that in mind, James, and then, I don't know, I promised Avinash the lion's sound.
Yeah, so very quickly.
No, I don't need to have the last word.
Okay, so in the framing of that question between sort of the working within the system, even though that was insanely whatever, versus sort of the inequalities and asymmetries in the system, I sort of want to push back and say maybe that's not the only way to tell the story. I think very quickly. So the resistance that Barbados is showing is really key. And Barbados has done this with the disaster clauses, the innovations that Barbados has sort of done over the last few years. If more countries were doing this, and if those were the stories we were telling, the stories of resistance to the system and not entrenching the system. Secondly, there are many earlier episodes of resistance. Some of it is told in a chapter that Michael Webel has written, sort of the fights between Mohamed Bejawi and Wadok in the International Law Commission, the UNCTAD's proposals for an alternative to the Paris Club, the date to the new international economic order, the London Agreement of 1953, but also power works in strange ways. When in Haiti, the slave owners left, they wanted to get paid. They indebted Haiti for decades, for more than a century afterwards. And there are many other examples. There are examples from the UK as well. So there are different ways you could organize this, and it's only that we want to tell the story from the center, but it's not the only story.
And the center doesn't own the tools, I think. I think it's I think we should be a little bit less shy about owning the tools. 3 words, Avinash, or we clap?
So there is the pretense of objectivity and independence on the debt sustainability analysis. But the debt restructuring is a direct byproduct of only 2 things: the primary surpluses that country can run and the growth rate expected. The IMF forecasts both.
Happy cherry blossoms. So thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you for joining us.